My grandfather left me his entire estate worth $4.5 million. The parents who cut me off at 20 showed up to the reading of the will grinning, saying they would kindly manage it for me. But when the judge turned to the next page, their entire world shattered. My name is Nia, and I am 32 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who severely underestimated your worth. Just sign the bottom right corner, Nia. The voice belonged to Bradley, my 35-year-old brother-in-law. He slid a thick stack of legal documents across the massive oak conference table, tapping the signature line with a gold-plated pen. He adjusted his silk tie, leaning back in his leather chair, with the kind of unearned confidence only a Wall Street finance bro could muster. Bradley was a white man who had married into my prominent African-American family, and he never missed an opportunity to play the savior, especially to me. You have to understand, he continued, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. $4.5 million is a massive responsibility. It is a highly complex financial portfolio left behind by your grandfather. Everyone in this room knows you simply do not have the capacity to manage that kind of wealth. I mean, let us be completely honest here. A young black woman who did not even finish her college degree should not be burdened with corporate assets, logistics companies, and massive tax liabilities. It is just going to overwhelm you, and we do not want to see you make a mistake that ruins your life. My father, Marcus, sat right next to Bradley, nodding solemnly. He wore his custom-tailored suit, playing the role of the distinguished patriarch to perfection. Listen to Bradley, Nia, my father said, using his deep, booming voice that he usually reserved for charity banquets and elite country club dinners in Atlanta. Your mother and I have discussed this at length. We are doing this for your own good. You have been out there struggling on your own for 12 years. We know life has not been easy for you. If you sign this power of attorney, you are giving me and Bradley full control to protect your grandfather's legacy. We will set up a monthly allowance for you. $3,000 a month, Bradley interjected quickly, flashing a bright, perfectly white smile. Tax-free. That is $36,000 a year just for existing. It is more than enough to cover your rent in whatever rough neighborhood you are currently living in, buy some decent clothes, and finally get your life on track. You will not have to worry about a single thing. We will handle all the heavy lifting. I sat in the plush leather chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, staring at the legal document they had so carefully prepared. The sheer audacity of the moment hung heavy in the air of the law firm. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic 14 floors below and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I did not immediately speak. Instead, I let my gaze sweep across the room, taking in the people who shared my blood, but had never truly been my family. My mother, Vivian, sat on the opposite side of the table next to my younger sister, Chloe. Vivian was the absolute epitome of Atlanta elite society. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture rigid, her entire identity wrapped up in her prestigious sorority alumni group and high society ladies' clubs. She was sipping sparkling water, looking at me with a mixture of pity and barely concealed disgust. Chloe, the undisputed golden child of the family, was busy checking her reflection in her phone screen, looking completely bored. She had always been the shallow one, obsessed with social media and designer labels, completely reliant on Bradley's income and our parents' endless indulgence. They honestly believed I was desperate. They had not spoken a single word to me since the day they threw me out of their house when I was 20 years old. They had kicked me to the curb with nothing but a suitcase because I refused to be their puppet. For 12 years, they assumed I had failed. They assumed my lack of contact meant I was drowning in poverty, too ashamed to crawl back and beg for their help. They looked at my understated navy blue dress and saw thrift store bargains, entirely missing the fact that it was a custom-tailored piece worth more than Bradley's entire outfit. They saw a quiet woman and assumed I was intimidated by their presence, by their wealth, and by this grand office. They did not know that my grandfather Jeremiah had spent the last 5 years of his life secretly mentoring me. They did not know that while they were busy spending his money on luxury cars and country club memberships, I was building my own private equity firm from the ground up. I knew exactly what this document was. It was a complete surrender of my rights designed to strip me of everything my grandfather had worked his entire life to build. Come on, Nia, Bradley urged, tapping the gold pen on the desk again, breaking the silence. We have a lunch reservation at the country club in an hour. Let us wrap this up. Just sign the paper and you can walk out of here with your first check today. Think about it. $3,000 right now. You can go treat yourself to a nice dinner tonight instead of whatever fast food you usually eat. I looked down at the gold pen resting on the flawless white paper. I slowly uncrossed my legs, leaned forward, and picked it up. A collective sigh of relief washed over my family. I saw Vivian relax her shoulders. I saw Marcus share a triumphant look with Bradley. Chloe finally put her phone down, ready to leave. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully manipulated the lost, uneducated daughter into handing over a $4.5 million empire for absolute pennies. They were practically salivating at the thought of liquidating my grandfather's hard-earned assets to fund their lavish lifestyles. I positioned my hand over the signature line. I pressed the tip of the pen against the thick parchment paper. But instead of signing my name, I pressed down hard and dragged the pen diagonally across the entire page, leaving a massive dark ink stain through their carefully drafted legal trap. I flipped to the second page and did the exact same thing, ruining the document entirely. "What are you doing?" Marcus snapped, his fake righteous tone instantly vanishing, replaced by genuine anger. "You are ruining the document. You foolish girl, do you have any idea how much it cost to have that drafted?" I stood up slowly, the silence in the room now replaced by a crackling electric tension. I looked directly at my white, arrogant brother-in-law. I tossed the gold pen across the table. It hit Bradley squarely in the center of his chest, right against his expensive silk tie before clattering onto the hardwood floor. "Keep your $3,000 allowance, Bradley," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. "I really do not need it. But you might want to hold on to that cash for yourself. I heard your exclusive black credit card got declined at the Rolex store in Buckhead last Tuesday. It must be so embarrassing to try and buy a watch you cannot afford in front of all your Wall Street friends." Bradley's face turned an ugly shade of crimson as he scrambled to catch the pen, failing miserably before it hit the floor. He opened his mouth to stammer out an excuse, but before he could form a single coherent word, a deafening crack shattered the silence of the room. Vivian slammed both of her perfectly manicured hands flat against the solid oak table. The impact was so violent that the crystal water pitchers rattled, and Chloe actually dropped her phone. My mother stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The mask of the refined Atlanta socialite vanished in an instant, replaced by the vicious, sneering woman I remembered all too well from my childhood. "How dare you speak to your brother-in-law that way?" Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You ungrateful little wretch, we bring you into this room out of the goodness of our hearts. We try to save you from your own spectacular incompetence, and you throw a tantrum like a common street thug. You have always been a disgrace to this family, Nia. Always." I did not flinch. I did not look away. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, matching her furious energy with an ice-cold stare. "Ungrateful," I asked, my voice dangerously low but carrying enough edge to make Marcus shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You really want to stand there in your Chanel suit and talk to me about being ungrateful, Vivian? Let us break that down. Let us talk about exactly what I should be so deeply grateful for. Should I thank you for the way you drained my entire college tuition fund when I was 20 years old?" Vivian stiffened her jaw, snapping shut. "Oh, you remember that, do you not?" I continued, my words hitting like calculated physical blows. "I remember walking into the financial aid office at the start of my junior year, completely exhausted from studying, only to have the registrar tell me my account was empty. Every single dime my grandfather had set aside for my education was gone. And why was it gone, Vivian? Because you decided Chloe absolutely needed a custom Porsche Panamera as a wedding gift for her first marriage. You stole my education to buy your favorite daughter a sports car for a marriage that barely lasted 6 months." Chloe gasped, dramatically clutching her pearl necklace as if she had been physically struck. "You leave my first marriage out of this, Nia? You are just bitter and jealous." Mom and Dad bought me that car because I actually respected them. I followed the rules. You are just mad because they wanted me to have a nice life, and you chose to be difficult. Jealous of what Chloe, I fired back without missing a beat, locking eyes with my sister. Am I jealous of your ability to max out other people's credit cards? Or maybe I am jealous of your incredible talent for sitting there looking pretty while your broke husband tries to steal my inheritance to cover his own bad investments. Bradley slammed his fist on the table. Listen here, Nia. Sit down and shut up, Bradley, I snapped, not even looking at him. The adults are speaking. Marcus finally stood up, his face a mask of furious patriarchal authority. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. You will watch your tone when you speak to your sister, and you will show respect to your mother. She gave you life. We provided for you. You provided for an image, Marcus, I replied, refusing to use his title as a father. You provided for the picture-perfect African-American elite family you wanted to parade around Buckhead, but the second I stepped out of your rigid little lines, you cut me off. Vivian sneered, leaning over the table. We did what we had to do. You were completely out of control. You deliberately embarrassed us in front of the entire Jack and Jill society. We are a prominent family, Nia. We have a legacy to maintain in Atlanta. I arranged for you to pledge my sorority, the most prestigious legacy line in the state, and you humiliated me by refusing. You told my chapter sisters you would rather work shifts at a dirty diner than join our sisterhood. You chose to live like trash, so we treated you like it. We let you pack your bags and leave because you were a toxic influence on this family. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed in the quiet room. The delusion in your head is truly masterful, Vivian. I worked at that diner because you completely cut off my food and housing allowance to punish me for not pledging your ridiculous sorority. You tried to starve me into submission. You kicked me out of the house with nothing but a black trash bag full of my clothes because I told you I wanted to study corporate finance instead of dropping out to marry whatever rich doctor you picked out for me. You did not just let me leave. You threw me onto the street and told the rest of the family I had developed a drug problem so no one would take me in. My parents exchanged a fleeting look of panic. They had not expected me to bring that up. They had spent 12 years telling their wealthy friends and our extended relatives that I was a troubled addict who ran away from home. They used my fake tragic story to garner sympathy at their country club dinners. That is a complete fabrication, Marcus blustered, adjusting his suit jacket, though a thin layer of sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. You were unstable. We practiced tough love. It was for your own good. We hoped it would force you to realize how much you needed us. And instead, it forced me to realize exactly what kind of people you are. I countered, my voice rising slightly, cutting through his pathetic excuses. You expected me to fail. You expected me to end up bankrupt, homeless, and begging at your doorstep. You wanted me broken so you could play the magnanimous, forgiving parents. But that did not happen, did it? I survived. I took the night shifts. I paid my own way through the rest of my degree. And I did not take a single penny from you. Chloe scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. Oh, please, stop acting like you are some self-made martyr. You are sitting here wearing cheap clothes, probably taking the bus to get to this meeting, and you are trying to lecture us about success. Bradley is a senior director at an investment firm on Wall Street. Dad sits on 4 corporate boards. You are nothing, Nia. You have always been nothing. That is why Grandpa left the money for us to manage. He knew you would just waste it. Did he? I asked, tilting my head, a slow predatory smile spreading across my face. I looked past my family, directing my attention to the older gentleman sitting quietly at the head of the table. Judge Davis, my grandfather's personal attorney and the executor of the estate, had been watching the entire exchange with a totally neutral expression. He had not intervened when Vivian screamed. He had not flinched when the pen hit Bradley. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his leather briefcase. Mr. Davis, I said smoothly, my tone shifting instantly from fierce to perfectly professional. I believe my family has a severe misunderstanding of the legal document we are here to discuss today. Bradley and my father seem to believe they have the authority to manage this $4.5 million estate on my behalf. They seem to think they hold the power in this room. Would you mind clarifying the exact terms of my grandfather's will for them? Bradley let out a condescending chuckle, shaking his head. Naya, do not waste the judge's time. The power of attorney document is standard procedure. We are the designated trustees. It is over. Is that so, Mr. Davis? I asked, keeping my eyes locked on Bradley while speaking to the lawyer. The room suddenly felt much colder. Vivian stopped glaring at me and turned to look at the lawyer. Marcus slowly lowered himself back into his chair, a sudden look of unease washing over his face. Chloe stopped pretending to be bored. Judge Davis cleared his throat. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a pristine, blue-bound legal document. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the page before looking up at my parents. Actually, Bradley Judge Davis said, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of the law. You are entirely incorrect. The document you drafted and attempted to have Nia sign today holds absolutely no legal merit. Furthermore, I must inform you that trying to coerce an heir into signing away their rights under false pretenses is highly illegal. Bradley's smug smile vanished instantly. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Marcus is Jeremiah's son. He is the natural executor of the estate. The money falls under his conservatorship. Judge Davis slowly shook his head, flipping the heavy parchment paper to the 4th page. He flattened the document on the table, making sure everyone could see the bold red seal at the bottom. I am afraid Jeremiah was extremely specific in his final wishes, the judge stated, looking directly at my father. We are now moving to Section 4 of the Last Will and Testament of Jeremiah Hayes. The air in the room was sucked out completely. My mother gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. My father stopped breathing. I simply leaned back in my chair, smoothing the skirt of my dress, waiting for the exact moment their entire false reality shattered into pieces. I direct your attention to Clause 4, subsection B of the verified will. Judge Davis began, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a steel blade. It explicitly states, and I quote my client directly here, the entirety of my liquid assets, real estate holdings and controlling shares in Hayes Logistics, totaling an estimated $4.5 million, shall pass directly, wholly and solely to my granddaughter Nia Hayes. Judge Davis paused, running his finger down the crisp page before looking up directly at my father. Furthermore, Jeremiah added a highly specific addendum to this clause. He read on, his tone devoid of any emotion. These assets are to be held in a private trust that Nia Hayes alone controls. Marcus Hayes, Vivian Hayes, and Chloe Hayes are expressly forbidden from holding any fiduciary power, acting as trustees, or gaining any financial benefit whatsoever from this estate. Any attempt by said parties to contest this will or challenge Nia's authority shall immediately trigger a penalty clause, rendering the challenging parties personally liable for all legal fees incurred by the estate. The air vanished from the room. The sheer force of my grandfather's words, spoken from beyond the grave, hit my family like a physical blow. Marcus turned an alarming shade of gray, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. He gripped the edges of the heavy oak table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Vivian let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. Her carefully curated mask of the refined, untouchable Atlanta socialite completely dissolved, leaving behind a frantic, panicked woman who suddenly realized her primary source of funding had just been permanently severed. Chloe was the first to actually break the silence. She slapped her hands against her thighs and let out a shrill, piercing whine. This is a mistake. That is completely impossible. Grandpa promised me the inheritance. He knew I needed it to renovate my new house in Buckhead. You are reading it wrong. Judge Davis did not even blink at my sister's outburst. He simply closed the blue folder, rested his hands on top of it, and looked at her with polite exhaustion. I assure you, young lady, I am reading exactly what your grandfather dictated to me while in perfect mental health. The document is ironclad. Bradley's face contorted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He could not comprehend what was happening. In his privileged, arrogant worldview, a young black woman whom he deemed uneducated and unworthy was never supposed to win. She was never supposed to hold the power. He had walked into this law firm expecting to bully a desperate broke relative into surrendering a multi-million-dollar fortune, and instead he had just been completely outmaneuvered by a dead man and a granddaughter who refused to play along. Bradley shot up from his chair. The heavy piece of furniture tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the floor, but he did not even look at it. He slammed both of his fists onto the conference table, leaning aggressively toward me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You listen to me right now, you arrogant little fraud," Bradley snarled, his voice vibrating with absolute rage. "You are not getting a single dime of that money. Do you hear me? Not one single penny. You think a piece of paper is going to stop me? I work on Wall Street. I manage portfolios worth 10 times this pathetic little estate. I know exactly how the legal system works, and I know exactly how it crushes people like you." I sat perfectly still, maintaining eye contact, letting him expose the full depth of his malicious nature. "I am going to tie this estate up in probate court for the next decade," Bradley threatened, his face turning redder by the second. "First thing tomorrow morning, I am filing an emergency injunction to freeze every single asset attached to Jeremiah Hayes. I will claim undue influence. I will claim elder abuse. I will tell the judge you manipulated a sick old man into signing over his fortune. By the time I am done filing motions, those accounts will be locked down so tight you will not even be able to buy a cup of coffee with that money." Vivian immediately latched onto Bradley's threat, her eyes lighting up with desperate malice. Yes, she practically cheered, pointing an accusing finger at me. "We will drag your name through the mud, Nia. I will make sure everyone in our social circle knows you are a thief. You will never be able to show your face in Atlanta again." Bradley sneered, emboldened by my mother's support. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking down his nose at me with ultimate disdain. "You have no idea what you are up against, Nia. The legal system is a rich man's game, and you are playing with empty pockets. Do you know how much it costs to fight a prolonged battle in probate court? It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. You work some dead-end job. You live in a cramped apartment. You probably have a negative balance in your checking account right now." He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the glass walls of the conference room. "How are you going to fight me?" he demanded, spreading his arms wide. "You cannot even afford to pay the initial filing fees, let alone hire a decent lawyer to represent you. You are going to go bankrupt, trying to fight a war you have already lost. You are going to starve before a judge ever unfreezes those assets. I am going to bleed you dry, Nia, until you come crawling back to this very table, begging me to take control of this estate." He finished his tirade, breathing heavily, entirely convinced of his own supreme victory. He thought he had delivered the ultimate checkmate. He thought his intimidation tactics had paralyzed me with fear. I let the silence stretch out for 3 agonizingly long seconds. I wanted him to feel secure. I wanted him to stand at the absolute peak of his arrogance before I shoved him off the ledge. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed my chair back. I stood up. The movement was fluid and entirely unbothered. From my standing position, I looked down at him. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently that the air felt thick with it. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply looked at him the way a predator looks at trapped prey. I reached into my designer handbag, my fingers brushing past my encrypted work tablet and my portfolio files until I found my sleek leather card holder. I slipped out a single heavy matte black business card, embossed with thick gold foil lettering. I held the card between 2 fingers for a moment, letting the overhead light catch the golden letters before I flicked my wrist. The heavy card slid smoothly across the polished oak table, spinning slightly, before coming to a complete stop exactly 1 inch away from Bradley's clenched fists. Bradley looked down at it. Marcus and Vivian leaned in, their eyes darting to the card. "Go ahead and sue me, Bradley," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a lethal, commanding edge that made the entire room freeze. "File the emergency injunction. Call your Wall Street buddies. Do whatever makes you feel like a powerful man. But before you drag me into a legal battle, you should probably know exactly who you will be facing in the courtroom." Bradley stared at the business card. His mouth fell open slightly. The color began to rapidly drain from his face as his eyes scanned the embossed gold letters. I read the text on the card aloud for the benefit of my parents, ensuring every single syllable hit its mark. Sterling and Sterling, I recited calmly. They are the most ruthless, aggressive, and astronomically expensive corporate litigators on the entire East Coast. They specialize in destroying people who try to contest legitimate trusts. I stepped away from the table, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored dress, exuding a quiet, terrifying authority. I did not just go in for a free consultation, Bradley. I continued, my eyes locked onto his panicked face. I retained their firm exclusively. They belong to me now. And you are entirely right about one thing. Legal battles are incredibly expensive. That is exactly why I wired them a $500,000 retainer fee in cold, hard cash last month. Chloe let out a choked gasp. Marcus collapsed back into his chair as if his legs had given out. Vivian covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Bradley looked like he was going to be sick. He opened his mouth to speak, to challenge me to find some flaw in my armor, but no words came out. The realization was finally hitting him. The woman he thought was a broke, uneducated failure had just casually dropped $500,000 solely to build a legal fortress around her empire. I offered them one last chilling smile. I highly suggest you check your own bank accounts, Bradley, before you try to start a war you cannot afford to finish. Mr. Davis, thank you for your time today. We are done here. The threat of my legal representation worked exactly as intended. Bradley retreated instantly, his arrogant bluster evaporating the second he realized I possessed the capital to utterly obliterate him in a courtroom. The family quickly understood they could not win a legal battle without risking their own absolute financial ruin. But Vivian Hayes was not a woman who accepted defeat. When she realized she could not strip me of my wealth, she simply changed the battlefield. She resorted to the only weapon she truly understood: her social capital. 3 weeks after the reading of the will, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was an invitation to the annual Jack and Jill Alumni Charity Gala, the most exclusive, highly anticipated event for Atlanta's African-American elite. Chloe had sent it. It was a blatant trap, a highly orchestrated public execution of my character, and I knew exactly what they were planning. I also knew I had to attend. I arrived at the St. Regis Atlanta, wearing a custom emerald silk gown that commanded attention without screaming for it. The valet took my keys, and I stepped into the grand ballroom. The space was a dazzling display of wealth and prestige. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer dresses. Jazz music floated through the air, mixing with the low hum of powerful people making powerful connections. This was Vivian's kingdom, the very center of her identity. I handed my embossed ticket to a hostess holding a gold clipboard. She scanned the list, her professional smile faltering for a brief second before she nodded. "Right this way, Miss Hayes." I followed her past the prime tables near the stage, past the prominent doctors, the local politicians, and the wealthy business owners. We kept walking toward the back of the ballroom. We walked until the music grew faint and the lighting dimmed. Finally, the hostess stopped at a small, cramped table shoved directly against the swinging wooden doors of the hotel kitchen. "Table 89, she said, her voice laced with pity. "Enjoy your evening." The spot was intentionally humiliating. Every 30 seconds, the heavy doors would swing open, hitting the back of my chair. The elegant scent of expensive perfume in the ballroom was completely overpowered by the harsh smell of industrial dish soap and roasted garlic. Waiters rushed past me carrying heavy trays, completely ignoring my presence. It was the worst seat in the entire venue, deliberately chosen to remind me of my supposed place in their hierarchy. I took my seat smoothly, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. I did not flinch when a waiter accidentally bumped my shoulder. I simply sat straight, my posture immaculate, observing the room like a general surveying a battlefield. Well, look who actually showed up. I turned my head slowly. Chloe stood a few feet away, holding a flute of champagne. She wore a gaudy, overly sequined dress that looked expensive but lacked any real taste. She was flanked by 2 of her equally shallow friends, all of them staring down at me with identical expressions of smug satisfaction. "I am honestly shocked you came, Nia," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Mom and I were just saying we did not think you owned anything formal enough for the St. Regis. I see they put you all the way back here. It is such a shame we ran out of premium seating. But then again, you are so used to eating in dirty diners, this probably feels right at home for you. Her friends giggled, raising their glasses to hide their smirks. I looked at Chloe, my expression perfectly neutral. Your dress has a snag on the left hem, Chloe, I said quietly. You might want to get that fixed before someone assumes Bradley's credit cards are declining again. Chloe's smile vanished. She instantly looked down at her dress, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment before she glared at me and stormed off toward the front of the room. I turned my attention back to the center of the ballroom. Several tables away, bathed in the best lighting the venue had to offer, Vivian was holding court. She was sitting at a VIP table surrounded by the most influential society matrons in Atlanta. These were women who controlled charity boards, country club admissions, and social registries. If you were blacklisted by this specific group of women, you practically ceased to exist in Atlanta high society. Vivian was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She spoke just loud enough for her voice to carry over the jazz music, ensuring that the surrounding tables could hear every single word of her tragic tale. It simply breaks a mother's heart, Vivian sighed dramatically, pressing a lace handkerchief to her chest. She looked around the table, making sure she had the absolute attention of every woman present. Marcus and I have done everything for that girl. We gave her the best education, the best opportunities, and she threw it all back in our faces. A prominent judge's wife leaned in, her eyes wide with gossip. Is it true what they are saying, Vivian, about the will? Vivian let out a long, shuddering breath, shaking her head, as if the mere thought caused her physical pain. I wish I could say it was just a rumor. Nia has completely lost touch with reality. She has developed these severe, terrifying delusions. She actually believes my father left his entire estate to her. She barged into our lawyer's office completely unhinged, demanding control over corporate assets she cannot even comprehend. The women at the table gasped in unison. We tried to get her psychiatric help. Vivian continued, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. We begged her to check into a facility to let us take care of her, but she just lashed out. She has become so greedy, so bitter about Chloe's success, that she is trying to freeze Marcus's retirement accounts. She wants to leave her own parents entirely penniless just to fund her delusions. That is absolutely despicable, an older woman in diamonds muttered, casting a disgusted glance in my direction. After everything you sacrificed for her, to try and bankrupt her own flesh and blood. You and Marcus must be devastated. We are living a nightmare, Vivian agreed, dabbing her dry eyes. We brought her here tonight because we still love her. We hoped being around decent people might snap her out of this psychotic episode. But look at her. She refuses to speak to anyone. She just sits in the back, plotting her next move against her own family. It is a tragedy, a complete mental collapse. The society wives murmured their agreement, casting harsh, judgmental glares toward my table by the kitchen doors. Word was already spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. I could see people whispering behind their hands, pointing subtly in my direction. The narrative was set. I was no longer just the rebellious daughter who ran away. I was now the crazy, greedy, ungrateful villain who was trying to steal her elderly parents' hard-earned retirement funds. Vivian caught my eye from across the room. She offered me a small, chilling smile, lifting her champagne glass a fraction of an inch in a silent toast. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully isolated me, surrounding me with a wall of social pariah status that I could never break through. She firmly believed that public humiliation would force me to surrender the estate, just to make the whispering stop. I did not break eye contact. I picked up my crystal water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. They thought this was the end of the game. They thought putting me by the kitchen doors and spreading vicious lies would break my spirit. They did not realize that I had not come to this gala to seek their approval. I had come to execute a hostile takeover. I reached into my clutch and wrapped my fingers around the small digital remote I had brought with me. I had anticipated this exact scenario. I knew Vivian would use this charity auction to publicly crucify me. I also knew that the charity auction relied on a massive digital display screen behind the main stage to showcase the items up for bidding. I waited until the event organizer tapped the microphone, signaling the beginning of the evening's main presentation. The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention toward the front stage, eager for the auction to begin. Vivian sat up straight, ready to bid on some exorbitant piece of jewelry to further solidify her status. I pressed the button on the remote. The massive digital screen behind the stage flickered. Instead of displaying a luxury vacation package or a diamond necklace, the screen went entirely black. Then a crisp, high-definition image appeared, towering 20 feet high for the entire ballroom to see. It was a scanned copy of a heavily redacted bank statement, but the names at the top were perfectly legible: Marcus and Vivian Hayes. Next to the names was a bold, undeniable list of current outstanding debts. The numbers were staggering: multiple defaulted mortgages, massive unpaid luxury credit card balances, 3 separate notices of intent to repossess their vehicles. A collective sharp intake of breath echoed through the St. Regis ballroom. I pressed the button a second time. The screen changed again. This time it displayed a certified letter from the IRS, highlighting a devastating amount of unpaid back taxes, followed by a formal warning of asset seizure. The silence in the room was absolute. The jazz music had stopped. The waiters froze in their tracks. The powerful society matrons who had just been pitying Vivian were now staring at the screen in pure, unadulterated shock. Vivian leaped out of her chair, her face draining of all color. "Turn it off!" she screamed at the event organizers, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "Turn that off right now. It is a lie. It is a hack." I stood up from my terrible table by the kitchen doors. I did not rush. I walked slowly, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor, cutting through the dead silence of the ballroom. I walked straight down the center aisle, passing the tables of people who had just been whispering about my supposed mental collapse. I stopped right in front of Vivian's VIP table. "You were just talking about mental delusions, Mother," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "You were telling all of these fine people that I was trying to bankrupt you. I figured it was only fair to show them that you are already bankrupt. You have been living on credit and fraudulent loans for 5 years. You are millions of dollars in debt, and you are about to lose the house you are currently sleeping in." Marcus rushed forward, trying to grab my arm, but I stepped back, my eyes blazing with a cold fire that made him freeze. "Do not touch me," I warned him. "You wanted to play games in public. You wanted to use my name to cover up your financial ruin. You tried to force me into signing away my grandfather's estate so you could liquidate his hard-earned corporate assets to pay off your massive tax fraud." Vivian was shaking, gripping the edge of her table to keep from collapsing. The society wives were leaning away from her, the stench of financial ruin acting as an instant repellent in their elite circle. "You are a monster," Vivian choked out, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face. "How could you do this to your own family?" I smiled, perfectly calm amidst the chaos. "I am not doing anything to you, Vivian. I am simply turning on the lights." I looked around the room, making sure everyone heard my next words. "My grandfather left his estate to me because he knew you would destroy it. He knew you were broke. And now so does the rest of Atlanta. Enjoy the rest of your gala." I turned on my heel, ready to leave them drowning in the absolute wreckage of their own making. The silence in the St. Regis ballroom was deafening, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a devastating car crash. The society matrons were paralyzed, their champagne flutes suspended halfway to their mouths. Vivian looked like she might actually faint, her impeccably manicured hand clutching the edge of the table as if it were a life raft. But denial is a highly potent drug, and arrogant men like Bradley were entirely addicted to it. A loud, sharp, and completely forced laugh suddenly erupted from the VIP table. It was Bradley. He threw his head back, clapping his hands together with a rigid, desperate enthusiasm that echoed harshly against the crystal chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please!" Bradley projected his voice across the room, adopting the booming, authoritative tone of a Wall Street executive managing a crisis. "Let us give a round of applause for this spectacular piece of amateur theater. I must say the Photoshop skills are almost convincing." He stepped out from behind the table, buttoning his suit jacket with an air of absolute superiority. He addressed the surrounding elite, spreading his arms wide as if welcoming them into a shared joke. "I apologize for my sister-in-law's dramatic outburst," Bradley declared, flashing his perfectly bleached teeth. As Vivian mentioned earlier, Nia has been dealing with some severe mental health struggles. She was recently removed from a family trust due to her instability, and unfortunately, this is her way of lashing out. A fabricated slideshow. A desperate, pathetic attempt to smear the Hayes family name because she could not get her hands on our money. The ballroom remained tense, but I could see the subtle shift in the posture of the elite crowd. They wanted to believe him. The idea that Marcus and Vivian Hayes, pillars of Atlanta society, were secretly bankrupt was simply too scandalous, too disruptive to their highly curated social order. It was much easier to believe the narrative of a bitter, unstable, estranged daughter. Vivian, sensing the shift, instantly straightened her spine. She plastered on a brave, long-suffering smile and dabbed at her eyes, playing the role of the victimized matriarch to absolute perfection. The event organizer, a nervous man in a crushed velvet tuxedo, saw an opening to salvage the charity event. He scrambled onto the main stage, grabbing the microphone with sweaty hands. The massive digital screen behind him flickered and returned to a generic philanthropic logo, the damning bank statements vanishing into the digital ether. "Well," the auctioneer announced, his voice cracking slightly, "we certainly appreciate passion when it comes to our charity efforts. Let us channel that energy into our main event. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for the centerpiece of our auction." Two white-gloved attendants carefully wheeled out a massive easel. Resting on it was a breathtaking original oil painting by a renowned contemporary African-American artist. The colors were vibrant, raw, and undeniably powerful. This original masterpiece, the auctioneer declared, his confidence returning, starts bidding at $100,000. "Do I hear 100,000? Before the echo of the opening bid could even settle over the room, Bradley snatched the gold-embossed bidding paddle directly out of Marcus's trembling hand. He did not hesitate. He did not consult his father-in-law. He simply seized control of the moment, desperate to prove his financial dominance, and erase the lingering doubts I had just planted in the minds of every socialite in the room. The focus of the entire ballroom shifted to Bradley's face. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated triumph. His cheeks were flushed with the thrill of the gamble. His eyes gleamed with a manic, aggressive energy. He thrust the gold paddle high into the air, holding it up like a weapon of mass destruction. 120,000, Bradley shouted, completely bypassing the starting bid. A ripple of impressed murmurs washed over the crowd. The society wives nodded approvingly. A bankrupt man does not casually throw down $120,000 for a charity painting. Bradley's calculated bluff was working. He was buying back their reputation in real time using phantom money he absolutely did not possess. I had paused near the exit doors, watching this spectacular display of self-destruction unfold. Bradley noticed me lingering. The sight of me standing there completely unbothered fueled his aggressive high. He wanted to crush me. He needed to humiliate me in front of the exact people I had just tried to warn. 130,000, a voice called out from the other side of the room. It was a prominent local surgeon raising his own paddle. Bradley scoffed loudly, making sure the microphone on the stage caught his voice. He raised his paddle again, turning his body so he was facing me directly. $150,000, Bradley roared, locking his furious, triumphant eyes onto mine. The crowd gasped. The auctioneer practically vibrated with excitement. 150,000 to the Hayes family table. Do I hear 160? Bradley lowered the paddle, but he did not break eye contact with me. He took 2 steps in my direction, invading my personal space from across the aisle. His voice carried effortlessly over the quiet jazz music that had resumed playing softly in the background. "You see that?" Nia Bradley taunted, pointing a finger at the magnificent painting. "That is what real wealth looks like. That is what success looks like. Not your cheap little computer tricks. You come in here trying to humiliate us, trying to pretend we are destitute, while you are standing there wearing what, a discount rack clearance dress from a suburban strip mall." He looked me up and down with exaggerated disgust, his upper lip curling into a sneer. He was completely oblivious to the fact that my emerald silk gown was a rare archival piece from a private European collection worth more than his entire annual salary. To his untrained, newly rich eyes, anything without a giant, gaudy designer logo plastered across the chest was cheap. Tell me, Nia Bradley continued, raising his voice so the VIP tables could hear every single word of his mockery. How did you even manage to get here tonight? I know you do not own a car. Did you take the city bus in your little discount dress? Or did you have to split an Uber pool just to afford the ride to the St. Regis? Chloe, emboldened by her husband's aggressive public display, stepped up beside him. She draped her arm possessively through his, puffing out her chest. She looked at me with pure, unfiltered disdain. She probably walked. Chloe chimed in her high-pitched voice, grating against the elegant atmosphere of the room. Look at the hem of her dress. It is probably dragging through the dirt. It is honestly pathetic, Nia. You are trying so hard to ruin our lives because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me. Jealous of my husband. Jealous of my lifestyle. Jealous of the fact that Mom and Dad actually love me. You are nothing but a bitter, broke failure who cannot stand to see us thrive. Vivian had recovered her posture completely. She sat at the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a serene, victorious smile back on her face. Her son-in-law was currently spending $150,000 of non-existent money to defend her honor, and she was basking in the restored admiration of her peers. The women around her were nodding sympathetically, murmuring about how tragic it was to have a daughter so deeply consumed by envy. Bradley took another step forward, closing the distance until he was only a few feet away from me. He lowered his voice slightly, pitching it for my ears and the ears of the immediate onlookers. You played your hand, Nia, and you lost, he sneered, pointing a finger directly at my chest. You thought you could rattle us. You thought you could scare me into backing off that estate. But all you did was prove exactly how desperate and pathetic you truly are. I just dropped 150 grand without blinking. Does that look like a man who is facing foreclosure? Does that look like a family drowning in debt? I am going to bury you in court. I am going to freeze every single asset your grandfather left, and I am going to watch you crawl back to the gutters where you belong. The auctioneer slammed his wooden gavel against the podium. Sold. For $150,000 to the Hayes family. The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic applause. Bradley turned away from me, raising his hands to accept the adulation of the crowd. Chloe beamed, blowing kisses to her mother's friends. They were celebrating a monumental victory. They truly believed they had completely dismantled my attack and proven their absolute superiority. I stood perfectly still, my expression utterly unchanged. I did not shrink back. I did not look away. I simply watched Bradley accept the congratulations of the men around him, watched Vivian sip her champagne with renewed arrogance, watched Chloe preen for the event photographer who had rushed over to capture the moment. They were so completely blinded by their own ego, so intoxicated by the illusion of their own grandeur, that they had absolutely no idea they had just walked directly into a fatal trap. They had just publicly committed to paying $150,000 to a highly prominent charity, money they absolutely did not have, while simultaneously confirming their identity on public record. The applause for Bradley's fraudulent generosity was still ringing in the air when I made my move. He stood there, his chest puffed out, soaking in the admiration of Atlanta's elite. Vivian was practically vibrating with pride, leaning over to accept congratulations from a state senator's wife. They were so desperate to maintain their illusion of wealth that they had blinded themselves to the reality of their situation. I knew exactly what Bradley was planning. He intended to slip away during the dinner service, speak privately with the charity organizers, and quietly arrange a payment plan he would inevitably default on or cancel the bid entirely, citing a sudden banking error. He just wanted the public glory without the actual cost. I was not going to let him get away with it. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the front of my emerald gown. I stepped out from the shadows of my assigned table by the kitchen doors and moved directly into the center aisle. The spotlight from the stage caught the silk of my dress, illuminating me for the entire ballroom to see. I did not raise a bidding paddle. I did not need one. $500,000, I stated. My voice was not a shout, but it possessed a sharp, carrying clarity that sliced right through the lingering applause. The clapping stopped instantly. The lively chatter died in the throats of the socialites. A heavy, electrified silence slammed down over the St. Regis ballroom. Every head turned in my direction. Up on the stage, the auctioneer blinked, lowering his wooden gavel. He peered through the bright stage lights, trying to locate the source of the astronomical bid. "I am sorry, did I hear $500,000? He asked, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. "You did," I replied, walking steadily toward the front of the room. My heels clicked against the polished floor, the sound echoing like a ticking clock in the silent hall. "I will bid $500,000 for the painting paid in full tonight." Bradley's face drained of all color. The smug, victorious smirk melted off his features, replaced by a look of profound, terrified confusion. He stared at me as if I had just grown a second head. Beside him, Chloe let out a sharp, derisive scoff, grabbing his arm. "Are you completely insane, Nia?" Chloe yelled, her voice pitching up into a shrill, hysterical frequency that made several women at the VIP tables visibly cringe. "You do not have $500,000. You live in a studio apartment. You take the bus. Do not come in here and ruin a charity event just to get attention. You are making a fool of yourself." Vivian jumped up from her seat, her face flushed with absolute fury. She pointed a trembling finger at the stage manager. "Have her removed," she demanded, her voice echoing shrilly. "She is having a mental episode. She is destitute and trying to make a mockery of this foundation. Security, get her out of here before she ruins the entire evening." I ignored them completely. I did not even spare them a glance. I walked right past their table, leaving them sputtering in my wake, and approached the main stage. The auctioneer looked down at me, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The tension in the room was suffocating. Hundreds of wealthy, influential people were holding their breath, waiting to see if the estranged, supposedly unstable daughter of the Hayes family was actually going to be escorted out by security. I reached into my clutch. I did not pull out a standard credit card. I retrieved a sleek, heavy, matte black American Express Centurion card, the infamous black card. It caught the stage lights, the heavy titanium glinting with undeniable authority. I held the card up. The camera of the live feed, which was projecting the event onto the massive digital screen behind the stage, zoomed in on my hand. The entire ballroom could see the unmistakable design of the most exclusive credit card in the world displayed 20 feet high. "I am not here to waste anyone's time," I said, addressing the auctioneer directly, while the screen broadcast my every move. "I bid $500,000. I expect you to run this card right now in front of everyone to verify the funds. There will be no payment plans. There will be no backroom deals. The transaction clears tonight." The auctioneer swallowed hard. He nodded frantically, signaling for the charity's finance director, who rushed to the edge of the stage with a mobile payment terminal. The room watched in absolute stunned fascination. Bradley was sweating profusely now. His eyes darted around the room, realizing that if my card cleared, his fake $150,000 bid would be exposed as the petty performative stunt it truly was. He could not stand it. He could not let me win. "This is a joke," Bradley shouted, stepping into the aisle, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "Even if that card is real, we all know whose money it is. You are spending Jeremiah's money. You stole an old man's inheritance, and now you are trying to flex it like you actually earned it. You are a fraud, Nia. You have never worked a real day in your life." Chloe immediately jumped in, her voice shrill and desperate. "Exactly. She is spending Grandpa's money. She tricked a dying man into giving her his estate, and now she is using his life savings to buy a painting. She does not even understand. It is disgusting. You are pathetic, Nia. You are just a cheap girl playing dress-up with a dead man's bank account." Vivian nodded vigorously, turning to the women at her table. "You see," she implored them, her voice shaking with righteous indignation. "She is blowing her grandfather's legacy on a single painting just to spite us. It is exactly what I warned you about. She is financially reckless and completely out of control." I handed the heavy titanium card to the finance director. He swiped it through the terminal. The machine beeped, processing the transaction. I turned around to face my family. I let my eyes sweep over Bradley's sweating face. Chloe's twisted sneer and Vivian's desperate panic-stricken eyes. "You are very quick to speak about things you do not understand, Chloe," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent ballroom. "My grandfather's estate is safely secured in a trust. I have not touched a single penny of his money. The funds on that card belong entirely to me. They belong to my company." Bradley let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Your company? What company? You run a blog. You sell essential oils." "Stop lying, Nia. You do not have a company that can drop $500,000 on a Tuesday night." The finance director stared at the terminal screen. His eyes went wide. He looked from the screen to me, his mouth slightly open. He tapped the auctioneer on the shoulder, showing him the green approval message. The transaction had cleared instantly. No fraud alerts, no declined messages, just a seamless transfer of $500,000. The auctioneer took a shaky breath. He gripped the microphone, his hands trembling slightly as he looked out at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing loudly through the speaker system. "The payment has been approved. The winning bid of $500,000 goes to Miss Nia Hayes." A loud collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The society matrons at Vivian's table stared at me in shock. Marcus slumped back in his chair, looking as though he had just been physically struck. Bradley's mouth fell open, his brain completely short-circuiting as he tried to process the fact that I had just effortlessly spent 3 times his annual salary. But the auctioneer was not finished. He looked down at the receipt printing from the terminal, his eyes scanning the corporate entity listed on the billing information. He cleared his throat again, adjusting his tie as he prepared to deliver a piece of information that would permanently alter the social landscape of Atlanta. Furthermore, the auctioneer said, his voice ringing with newfound reverence, "I have just been informed of the corporate entity attached to this generous donation. We owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to the MH Investment Group for this extraordinary contribution." A low murmur spread through the crowd. The MH Investment Group was a notoriously private, highly aggressive private equity firm that had been rapidly acquiring prime real estate and logistics companies across the East Coast. Everyone in the Atlanta business sector knew the name, but no one knew who actually ran it. The auctioneer raised his hand, gesturing directly toward me. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Miss Nia Hayes, the founder and chief executive officer of the MH Investment Group. And as we have just been notified by hotel management, we must also thank her for something else entirely." The auctioneer paused for dramatic effect. He looked directly at Vivian and Bradley, delivering the final fatal blow. "We must thank Miss Hayes because the MH Investment Group is not only the primary sponsor of tonight's gala, but as of this morning, her firm is the official owner of the St. Regis Atlanta. We are currently standing in her building." The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and total. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly vacuumed out of the ballroom. Vivian's face drained of color until she was deathly pale. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with terror, realizing that every single influential person she had just lied to was now staring at her with profound disgust. She had just spent the entire evening mocking, belittling, and attempting to humiliate the owner of the very building they were standing in, the woman who held enough power to buy the St. Regis in cash. Chloe swayed on her feet, grabbing the edge of a chair to keep from falling. Her gaudy sequined dress suddenly looked incredibly cheap in the presence of actual terrifying wealth. She stared at me, her eyes brimming with horrified tears, as she realized that the sister she had mocked for taking the bus was the architect of a multi-million-dollar empire. Bradley looked like he was going to vomit. The arrogant Wall Street director, the man who had threatened to bankrupt me with legal fees, was staring at a woman who could buy and sell his entire firm before breakfast. He realized with crushing clarity that I had not just beaten his bid. I had exposed him as a fraud. He had tried to play a high-stakes game with a woman who owned the casino. I turned my back on them. I did not need to say another word. I walked back down the center aisle, my head held high, the heavy silk of my emerald gown sweeping against the floor. The crowd parted for me instantly. The wealthy socialites, the politicians, the elite members of the Jack and Jill alumni who had ignored me all night now watched me with a mixture of fear and absolute awe. I left my family standing in the center of the ballroom, completely paralyzed by their own public destruction. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, surrounded by peers who now knew exactly who they were, broke, fraudulent, and entirely powerless. I walked out of the ballroom, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind me, leaving the shattered remains of the Hayes family legacy inside. The morning after the gala, the atmosphere in my downtown penthouse was a study in absolute tranquility. I sat at my marble kitchen island, sipping black coffee, while scrolling through the encrypted financial reports on my tablet. The silence was productive, heavy with the momentum of my growing empire. But 800 miles away, inside the glass and steel fortress of his Wall Street firm, Bradley was suffocating in a toxic cloud of his own humiliation. The news of his absolute public destruction at the St. Regis had not stayed in Atlanta. Elite social circles operate on a currency of gossip, and by dawn, the whispers had reached New York. Bradley had walked into his prestigious firm, not as the conquering hero, but as the punchline to a brutal joke. He was the man who had tried to publicly humiliate his broke sister-in-law, only to discover she owned the very ground he was standing on. His massive, fragile ego could not process the defeat. In his twisted reality, a young black woman from a family he deemed inferior was fundamentally incapable of outsmarting him. He convinced himself that my display of wealth was a temporary illusion, a fragile house of cards built on my grandfather's money that he could easily blow down. He just needed the right angle of attack. Bradley retreated to his corner office, locking the heavy glass door. He loosened his silk tie, his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes were bloodshot with vindictive mania. He was a senior director at Vanguard Elite Capital, a position that granted him access to an incredibly vast and highly restricted network of global financial intelligence. He decided to turn the full terrifying weight of that institution against me. Completely bypassing ethical firewalls and blatantly violating federal compliance protocols, Bradley began running unauthorized deep dive analytics on the MH Investment Group. He spent hours tearing through corporate registries, shell company holdings, and pending acquisitions. He was hunting for a vulnerability, a single weak point, where he could strike and watch my entire operation bleed out. By mid-afternoon, he found it. My firm was in the final stages of a highly sensitive, strictly confidential acquisition. We were quietly negotiating the purchase of a massive portfolio of distressed commercial real estate debt. It consisted of a dozen abandoned industrial warehouses and prime commercial lots located directly in the path of a proposed city transit expansion. The current owners were facing bankruptcy, and I had positioned MH Investment Group to absorb their debt for pennies on the dollar. Once the city announced the expansion, the value of those properties would skyrocket, solidifying my absolute dominance over the southern logistics sector. Bradley stared at his glowing monitor, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his sweating face. His arrogant mind immediately jumped to the wrong conclusion. He saw the sheer size of the pending acquisition and convinced himself this was the absolute limits of my capital. He assumed the $500,000 I had spent at the charity auction was a desperate, foolish flex that had left me dangerously overextended. He believed that if he stole this specific portfolio out from under me, he would sever my primary revenue stream, trigger a cascade of defaulted contracts, and drive me straight into bankruptcy. He did not just want to beat me, he wanted to eradicate me. The scene shifted rapidly, an intense, high-speed contrast between two entirely different worlds. In Atlanta, I sat calmly in my sunlit office reviewing architectural blueprints with my lead developer. My voice was steady, my directions clear and precise. In New York, Bradley was a man possessed. He hammered at his keyboard, pulling up Vanguard's internal transfer protocols. He barked vicious, hurried orders at his junior analysts over the intercom, demanding they expedite the paperwork without asking questions. I took a slow sip of green tea, casually signing a stack of non-disclosure agreements. Bradley gripped his gold fountain pen, his knuckles white as he signed off on a massive, unauthorized diversion of his client's funds. He was hijacking $15 million of Vanguard's corporate capital to fund his personal vendetta. He wired the money directly to a hastily formed shell company, instructing his legal team to aggressively approach the creditors holding the distressed properties. He offered them double my negotiated rate, demanding they sign the portfolio over to him immediately. It was a dirty, reckless, and entirely illegal abuse of his fiduciary power. I closed my laptop, neatly stacking my files, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across my desk. Bradley slammed his phone down into its cradle, leaning back in his leather chair. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his chest heaving as he let out a sharp, manic laugh. He had done it. He had swooped in at the 11th hour and bought the dead out from under me. He truly believed he had just delivered the kill shot. My encrypted private line began to ring. I picked it up, noting the caller ID. It was Marcus Vance, my lead acquisition manager. His voice was unusually tense, lacking its normal professional polish. Miss Hayes, Marcus said, breathing heavily. We have a massive problem. The sellers just pulled out of the commercial debt agreement. They refused to sign the final transfer. I leaned back in my chair, my expression completely neutral. Explain. A shadow buyer just came in over the top. Marcus continued, the frustration evident in his tone. They completely bypassed the standard negotiation window and wired $15 million directly to the creditors. It is double what the portfolio is actually worth in its current state. The sellers took the cash and ran. We lost the properties, Miss Hayes. The entire portfolio is gone. Before I could even formulate a response to Marcus, my secondary personal phone buzzed on the desk. A New York area code flashed across the screen. I knew exactly who it was. Hold on a moment, Marcus, I said smoothly. I will call you right back. I switched lines, pressing the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply let the silence stretch out, waiting for him to speak. Did you honestly think you could play in the big leagues? Nia Bradley's voice oozed through the speaker, thick with arrogant satisfaction. Did you really think throwing around a little bit of cash at a hotel ballroom made you a player? I remained silent, letting him expose the full depth of his delusion. I told you I manage portfolios 10 times the size of your pathetic little operation, Bradley gloated, his tone dripping with malice. I know exactly how to crush people like you. I just saw the wire transfer clear for those commercial properties in the West End. $15 million paid in full. I bought your entire future right out from under you. He let out another harsh, mocking laugh. You overplayed your hand, little girl, he taunted. You thought you could humiliate my family and walk away. I just bought the very debt you were counting on to keep your fraudulent company afloat. What are you going to do now, Nia? Your liquidity is gone. Your expansion is dead. You are going to be filing for Chapter 11 by the end of the quarter. I hope that cheap discount dress you wore last night was comfortable, because you are going to be wearing it to bankruptcy court. I listened to him breathe heavily into the receiver, completely drunk on his own perceived power. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought his $15 million theft was a brilliant tactical maneuver that had crippled my empire. Bradley. I said, my voice eerily calm, completely devoid of the panic he was so desperate to hear. I highly suggest you review the environmental hazard reports attached to the properties you just purchased. I hung up the phone before he could reply, tossing it onto my desk. I leaned back in my chair and allowed a slow, dangerous smile to touch my lips. Bradley thought he had stolen my greatest asset. He had no idea he had just swallowed a $15 million grenade and I held the pin. I had barely moved my hand away from the receiver when the heavy vibrating hum of my secondary phone shattered the quiet of my office again. I let it ring. 3 times. 4 times. I wanted them to sit in their anticipation. I wanted them to feel the adrenaline of their supposed victory coursing through their veins before I answered. With a fluid, unbothered motion, I reached out and tapped the speaker icon, leaning back into my leather chair and resting my fingertips together. I hope you are calling to apologize for your spectacular lack of decorum at the gala, I said, my voice smooth and entirely devoid of inflection. A chorus of harsh, mocking laughter echoed through the speaker. It was a vicious, synchronized sound. Marcus and Vivian were on a conference call, and they were practically vibrating with pure, unadulterated glee. Apologize? Marcus sneered, his voice thick with a suffocating, arrogant superiority. You really are completely delusional, Nia. We did not call to apologize. We called to offer you a reality check. We just got off the phone with Bradley. He told us everything, Vivian chimed in, her tone breathless and sickeningly sweet. He told us exactly how he just outsmarted you. It is honestly pathetic, Nia. Did you really think you could play in the big leagues? You think having some of your grandfather's money suddenly makes you an entrepreneur? Marcus demanded, his words dripping with deep-seated misogyny. Real business is a man's game, Nia. It requires a level of intellect, a killer instinct, and a pedigree that you simply do not possess. You thought you could put on a designer dress and suddenly sit at the table with the adults. But Bradley just reminded you exactly where you belong. I remained perfectly still, watching the audio waves peak and dip on the phone screen. Is that what he told you? I asked quietly. That he outsmarted me? He did not just outsmart you. He completely dismantled you. Vivian boasted her idolization of her white son-in-law, bleeding into every single syllable. Bradley is a senior director on Wall Street. He comes from generations of wealth, proper breeding, and a societal establishment you will never truly be a part of. He understands high-level finance in a way your little mind could never even begin to comprehend. A man like Bradley does not lose to an arrogant, ungrateful girl playing corporate dress-up. He just bought out your entire commercial portfolio. He legally stole your acquisition right out from under your nose. He squeezed the life out of your company in less than 24 hours. Marcus added, his voice lowering into a menacing, authoritative growl. You are completely overextended. Without those properties, your entire expansion plan is dead in the water. You are staring down the barrel of total bankruptcy, and you know it. I listened to them worship the very man who is currently dragging their family name into a federal financial catastrophe. The sheer irony of their blind devotion was almost poetic. They were so desperate to maintain their proximity to Bradley's perceived white elite status that they were eagerly cheering for the destruction of their own flesh and blood. They worshipped his whiteness, his maleness, and his Wall Street title, viewing him as a savior while viewing me as an unruly problem that needed to be put down. So what is the purpose of this call? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat, projecting the exact image of a defeated woman they were so desperate to hear. If I am already bankrupt, what do you want from me? We are calling because despite your horrific disrespect at the charity gala, we are still your parents, Vivian said, adopting a tone of fake condescending mercy. We convinced Bradley to show you a tiny bit of grace. He does not have to completely destroy your remaining assets. Bring the $4.5 million to Bradley to manage, Marcus commanded, dropping the ultimate ultimatum. Sign over full fiduciary control of Jeremiah's trust to your brother-in-law. Let a capable man handle the capital. If you bring that money to him today, I will personally tell him to leave you a way out. He will back off and let you keep whatever pathetic scraps are left of your little company. It is the only logical choice, Nia, Vivian urged, her voice laced with venomous sexism. Women in our family do not run empires. We rely on strong, educated men to protect us. Bradley is willing to step up and be the man of the family even after the way you humiliated him. You should be down on your knees thanking him for this lifeline. Give him the money before you lose absolutely everything. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing minute. I wanted their words to hang in the air, to permanently record their complicity, their arrogance, and their absolute betrayal. I reached over to my tablet, pulling up the highly confidential geological survey report that Vanguard Elite Capital had completely failed to review before Bradley authorized his reckless $15 million wire transfer. You want me to hand over my grandfather's entire legacy to Bradley? I stated, my voice dropping an octave, losing all traces of passivity and replacing it with a cold, terrifying authority. You want me to surrender my wealth to a man who just committed the most catastrophic financial suicide in the history of his firm? Stop being dramatic, Marcus snapped, irritated that I was not immediately sobbing and agreeing to his terms. Bradley made a brilliant tactical maneuver. Bradley acted like an impulsive, arrogant amateur, I corrected him sharply, my words slicing through the speakerphone like a scalpel. He was so blinded by his bruised ego, so desperate to put me in my place, that he completely bypassed standard due diligence. He did not run a Phase 1 environmental site assessment on those properties. If he had, or if you had possessed even a fraction of the business acumen you claim to have, you would know exactly why those commercial lots were being sold for pennies on the dollar. The line went completely quiet. The giddy, triumphant energy from my parents abruptly vanished, replaced by a sudden, creeping hesitation. "What are you talking about?" Vivian asked, her voice faltering. "I am talking about toxic soil, Vivian," I explained, speaking slowly and deliberately so they could comprehend the absolute magnitude of the disaster. "I am talking about decades of illegal chemical runoff from a defunct manufacturing plant that seeped directly into the groundwater beneath those warehouses. The Environmental Protection Agency just classified that entire portfolio as a federal Superfund site." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I was never going to buy those properties. I continued savoring the brutal reality I was unleashing upon them. I intentionally generated a fake paper trail of my interest. I baited the hook and Bradley swallowed it whole. By forcefully acquiring that debt and taking possession of those properties, Bradley just made his firm legally and entirely responsible for the federal cleanup costs. "You are lying!" Marcus stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous booming authority. "That is impossible. He is a professional. He would have checked." "He did not check because he was too busy trying to prove he was superior to a black woman," I stated, ignoring his weak protest. "The cleanup is estimated to cost upwards of $50 million. And because Bradley bypassed his firm's compliance protocols to authorize an illegal unvetted $15 million wire transfer to satisfy a personal vendetta, Vanguard Elite Capital is not going to protect him. They are going to throw him directly to the federal authorities. He is going to be investigated for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and gross negligence." I paused, letting the sheer weight of the impending destruction crush them. "Your golden boy is not a genius, Marcus. He is a criminal who is about to be indicted, fired, and sued into absolute oblivion by his own employers," I said, my voice echoing with finality. "So no, I will not be handing over my grandfather's $4.5 million for him to manage. I highly suggest you and Vivian start looking for a good bankruptcy lawyer, because when the federal investigators seize Bradley's assets, they are going to seize yours right along with them." I reached out and tapped the red button on the screen, cutting the call dead. I did not wait to hear their screams, their denials, or their inevitable panic. I simply sat back in my chair, looking out at the sweeping skyline of Atlanta. The war was no longer fought in the shadows. It was entirely out in the open, and I had just detonated the very ground they stood on. "How do you feel about the way the tables have turned so far?" The silence in my office was profound, heavy with the weight of absolute victory. I had delivered the warning, but I knew the psychology of the Hayes family better than they knew themselves. Arrogance is a blinding disease. They would never believe that I, the estranged daughter they had spent a lifetime discarding, could orchestrate a financial trap of this magnitude. They would write off my warning as a desperate, hysterical bluff. They would convince themselves that the toxic soil was a lie I invented in a moment of sheer panic. I turned back to my glowing monitor, my expression hardening into cold, unbreakable resolve. I opened my encrypted corporate email client and drafted a single concise message to my elite legal team. The fish took the bait. He just dumped $15 million of client capital into the shell company I established. Send the complete evidence file to the Securities and Exchange Commission immediately. I hit send. The digital confirmation flashed across the screen, permanently sealing Bradley's fate. There was no turning back now. The federal machinery was officially in motion. Later that evening, the sprawling $3 million Buckhead estate of Marcus and Vivian Hayes was bathed in the warm golden glow of imported crystal chandeliers. The sheer opulence of the residence was a desperate, aggressive testament to their lifelong obsession with high society status. Vaulted ceilings framed a massive open-concept living space adorned with custom Italian leather furniture, priceless modern art, and a sweeping marble staircase. It was a fortress of superficial wealth designed specifically to intimidate outsiders and mask the deep, rotting financial insecurities festering within the family. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was one of jubilant, triumphant celebration. The soft clinking of expensive crystal echoed through the grand room as they prepared to claim their final victory over my independence. Marcus stood proudly by the custom mahogany wet bar, pouring generous measures of vintage Dom Perignon. His chest was puffed out, his posture radiating the smug satisfaction of a patriarch who believed he had finally brought his rebellious daughter to heel. Vivian was lounging gracefully on a pristine white sofa, her face flushed with champagne and vindictive delight. Beside her, Chloe leaned affectionately against Bradley, looking up at her husband with undisguised reverent adoration. Bradley was the absolute center of attention, holding court in the middle of the room like a conquering king. He wore a sharply tailored bespoke suit, a crystal tumbler of aged scotch in one hand, and a thick stack of legal documents resting on the glass coffee table before him. "It is honestly a textbook psychological response," Bradley was saying, his voice booming with arrogant authority. She lashed out on the phone earlier because she realized she was entirely cornered, making up wild, desperate lies about environmental hazards and Superfund sites. It is truly pathetic. She thought she could play a high-stakes financial game, but the moment I applied real aggressive Wall Street pressure, her entire operation folded like a cheap tent. He picked up his scotch, taking a slow, dramatic sip while looking around at his captive audience. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. High-level finance is a brutal battlefield. It requires a ruthless, analytical mind that women simply do not possess. They get emotional, they get attached, they lack the killer instinct required to survive and thrive. Women should always step aside and let capable men handle the heavy lifting of capital management. She will walk through those doors tonight, sign these transfer papers, hand the $4.5 million trust into my control, and I will be magnanimous enough to let her keep her little LLC from going completely bankrupt." Marcus nodded in vigorous agreement, handing a freshly poured glass of champagne to Vivian. "Exactly, Bradley. You put her right back in her proper place. She needs a strong man to manage that inheritance anyway. Jeremiah was a complete fool to leave it to her, but thankfully, we have you to correct his massive mistake." Vivian smiled, taking a delicate sip of her expensive drink. "I just hope she has the common decency to look appropriately grateful when she signs the transfer," she added, her tone dripping with intense condescension. "We are throwing her a massive lifeline. She would be utterly ruined by tomorrow morning if we did not generously intervene." The heavy custom iron wrought double doors of the mansion suddenly swung open, the solid weight of them echoing loudly through the cavernous foyer. The laughter and self-congratulatory chatter in the living room died instantly. Every head turned toward the entryway. I stepped over the threshold, my posture impeccably straight, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I wore a tailored charcoal gray power suit that commanded immediate respect. But I was not alone. Flanking me on my right was Arthur Davis, one of the most ruthless and high-profile corporate litigators in the entire state of Georgia. On my left stood a tall, broad-shouldered man, wearing a severe black suit, a federal badge discreetly clipped to his belt, and an expression entirely devoid of emotion. The silence in the living room was immediately suffocating. The triumphant, giddy smiles melted off their faces, replaced by a sudden, creeping confusion. Bradley lowered his glass of scotch, his eyes darting defensively from Lawyer Davis to the imposing federal agent at my side. He swallowed hard, attempting to force a smug smirk back onto his face, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of control in front of his adoring in-laws. "Well, well," Bradley sneered, though his voice distinctly lacked its previous booming resonance. "You actually showed up. And you brought an audience. I suppose you need a lawyer to hold your hand while you surrender your assets." He gestured dismissively toward the thick stack of legal documents resting on the glass table. "The transfer papers are right here, Nia. $4.5 million directly into my managed fund. Sign on the dotted line right now, and I will make the call to back off your commercial portfolio." I did not break my stride. I walked directly into the center of their opulent living room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I looked at the champagne flutes, the celebratory smiles that had instantly turned to masks of anxiety, and the utter, pathetic delusion radiating from every single person in the room. I did not even look at the papers on the table. I looked directly into Bradley's eyes, watching the very first tiny cracks of genuine, unadulterated terror begin to form behind his arrogant facade. "I am not here to sign anything, Bradley," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, devastating authority that paralyzed the entire room. "I am here to watch you lose everything." Bradley let out a sharp, breathless scoff, his eyes darting frantically between me, Arthur, and the stone-faced federal agent. He was desperately trying to cling to his reality, the one where he was the untouchable Wall Street titan, and I was nothing more than an insolent child. He pointed a trembling finger at me, a nervous sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Are you paying actors now, Nia?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Is this your grand, pathetic finale? You break into my in-laws' home with hired thugs to put on a show because you are too broke to afford a real legal defense." I did not smile. I did not raise my voice. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, until I was standing directly over the glass coffee table. I looked down at the pristine stack of transfer papers he had so arrogantly prepared, the documents explicitly designed to legally strip away my grandfather's legacy. With one swift, deliberate motion of my hand, I swept the entire stack off the table. The heavy parchment scattered across the imported Persian rug, fluttering down around his expensive Italian leather shoes like dead leaves. The man on my left did not wait for an invitation. He stepped forward, reaching into his tailored breast pocket. He produced a dark leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold shield that caught the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. "Agent Miller Securities and Exchange Commission," the man stated. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that instantly vacuumed the remaining oxygen from the room. "Bradley Scott, you are currently under formal federal investigation for wire fraud, embezzlement of corporate funds, and egregious violations of federal insider trading laws." Vivian gasped, her fingers going slack. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor with a sharp, violent crack that echoed like a gunshot. The expensive golden liquid pooled around her feet, but she did not even look down. She stared at the federal badge, her face draining of all color, until she looked entirely, completely bloodless. Bradley stumbled backward, his calves hitting the edge of the custom sofa. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His arrogant sneer had completely vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "This is a mistake," Marcus stammered, stepping forward, his hands raised defensively. "My son-in-law is a senior director at Vanguard Elite Capital. He is a respected financial manager. There is absolutely no way he is involved in anything illegal. You have the wrong man." "He is exactly the right man," I corrected, coldly turning my gaze to Marcus. "Your respected financial manager just bypassed his firm's strictest compliance firewalls to steal $15 million of his client's capital." Chloe grabbed Bradley's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the sleeve of his bespoke suit. "Bradley, tell them they are lying," she pleaded, her voice pitching up into a shrill, hysterical frequency. "Tell them you did not do anything wrong." Bradley could not look at her. He could not look at anyone. His eyes were fixed on me, wide and utterly panic-stricken. He was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the trap he had sprinted into. "The commercial real estate portfolio you just purchased, Bradley," I said, taking a slow, measured step closer to him. "The one you thought you were stealing out from under me to bankrupt my firm. It is entirely worthless. It is a toxic wasteland." I watched his throat work as he swallowed hard, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. "I did not just discover those properties. I continued, my words slicing through the suffocating silence like a scalpel. I manufactured the entire acquisition. I created the shell company. I planted the digital breadcrumbs directly in your line of sight because I knew you were illegally monitoring my firm's activities. I fed you a meticulously crafted illusion of a highly profitable transit expansion deal. I knew your massive, fragile ego could not resist the urge to steal my success. You took the bait perfectly. You bought a portfolio of condemned, chemically contaminated land that is currently being investigated by the Environmental Protection Agency. No. Bradley wheezed, shaking his head frantically. No, the value was there. The analytics proved the value. The analytics were a mirage, Arthur Davis interjected, speaking for the first time. His tone was sharp and professional, the voice of a man who dismantles corporate empires for a living. You purchased a massive liability, Mr. Scott. You bypassed due diligence to satisfy a personal vendetta, and in doing so, you chained your firm to tens of millions of dollars in federal cleanup costs. I turned back to Bradley, refusing to let him look away from his own destruction. You violated federal laws to bankrupt me, I stated. But all you did was hand the SEC a perfectly wrapped confession of embezzlement. Chloe let out a piercing guttural scream. She shoved Bradley away from her, her face contorted in a mixture of horror and profound disgust. You stole $15 million, she shrieked, spittle flying from her lips. Are you insane? You are going to go to federal prison. What about my life? What about my house? Arthur Davis reached into his slim leather briefcase. He retrieved a single crisp document bearing the unmistakable corporate letterhead of Vanguard Elite Capital. He held it out, extending it directly toward Bradley's trembling hands. Your firm's internal risk management team caught the unauthorized wire transfer shortly after it cleared the shadow account, Arthur explained, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. They audited your terminal. They have a complete digital record of you overriding the compliance protocols. Vanguard Elite Capital terminated your employment exactly 10 minutes ago. Bradley stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. He did not take it. He simply let it fall from Arthur's hand, watching it join the scattered transfer papers on the rug. Furthermore, Arthur continued flawlessly. Vanguard's legal team has already initiated civil litigation against you. They are currently working with federal authorities to freeze every single one of your personal assets. Your bank accounts, your investment portfolios, the Hamptons property, and all credit lines attached to your name or your wife's name have been locked effective immediately. They are coming for everything you own to recover the stolen capital. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on Bradley with the force of a falling building. The arrogance, the pristine tailoring, the Wall Street pedigree, it all disintegrated in a matter of seconds. His knees literally gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the marble floor, landing heavily amidst the scattered documents he had intended to use to ruin my life. He grabbed his hair, pulling at the perfectly styled strands, letting out a low, pathetic whimper that sounded more like a wounded animal than a senior director. Chloe dropped to her knees beside him, not to comfort him, but to shake him violently. Do something, she screamed, slapping his shoulder. Call your boss. Call your lawyers. You cannot let them take my money. You cannot let them take my life. Vivian sank back down onto the white sofa, burying her face in her hands as she began to sob uncontrollably. Her pristine high society world was evaporating before her eyes. The son-in-law she had worshipped, the man she had used to belittle me at every opportunity, was a disgraced criminal who had just dragged their entire family into a federal scandal. Marcus stood frozen by the bar, the bottle of Dom Perignon still resting near his hand, his mouth slightly open as he stared at the wrecked, sobbing mess of the man he had called a genius just 5 minutes ago. I looked down at Bradley, watching him gasp for air on the floor of his in-laws' mansion. There was no pity in my chest. There was no remorse. He had promised to destroy me, and I had simply provided him with the tools to destroy himself. I told you, Bradley, I said quietly, my voice carrying easily over Chloe's hysterical screaming. Women in my family do not need a man to handle their finances. We handle our own business. I turned my back on the pathetic scene, gesturing for Arthur and Agent Miller to follow me. I walked out of the mansion, my head held high, leaving the Hayes family to drown in the ruin of their own making. The initial shock of the federal raid on their golden boy had paralyzed them, but as I advanced into the center of their opulent sanctuary, that paralysis morphed into a desperate feral rage. They were watching the absolute destruction of their carefully curated high society image, and their immediate instinctual response was to project that panic onto the easiest target in the room. You vindictive, ungrateful little wretch! Marcus roared, his booming voice returning as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. His chest heaved beneath his expensive tailored shirt, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. How dare you bring this filth into my home? You orchestrate some pathetic illegal scheme to ruin your sister's husband. And you bring federal agents into my living room to gloat. Vivian stood up from the pristine white sofa, her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. She completely ignored the reality that her son-in-law had just been exposed as a massive corporate embezzler. Her only concern was the violation of her perceived kingdom. "You are a monster!" Nia Vivian shrieked, her voice pitching up into a shrill, hysterical frequency that echoed harshly against the vaulted ceilings. "We threw you a lifeline. We tried to save you from your own incompetence. And this is how you repay us, by trespassing in our home with hired thugs to put on a theatrical display. Get out! Get out of my house before I call the police and have you arrested." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood there absorbing their blinding, arrogant entitlement, watching them desperately try to maintain the illusion of their patriarchal supremacy, even as the walls were caving in around them. Lawyer Davis stepped forward, adjusting his suit jacket with a calm, surgical precision that commanded immediate attention. He cleared his throat, a sharp, authoritative sound that sliced through Vivian's screaming. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, I strongly advise you to lower your voices. Stop making baseless legal threats against my client and listen very carefully to what I am about to say," Davis stated, his tone dropping into a lethally calm register. "You are operating under a severe, catastrophic misunderstanding of your current situation." Marcus scoffed, gripping the edge of the wet bar as if trying to anchor himself to his fabricated reality. "You have no authority here, Davis. You are an executor. You handle my father's trust, nothing more. If the 4.5 million is tied up in her ridiculous games, fine. We do not need it. This is my property. This is my domain. We hold the power here, not you, and certainly not her." Davis reached into his slim leather briefcase and pulled out a thick sealed document bound in heavy legal binding. He held it up for them to see. "That is precisely what we are here to discuss," Marcus Davis said, his eyes narrowing. "You see, the $4.5 million you were so desperately trying to extort from Nia tonight was only part one of Jeremiah Hayes's final will and testament." Vivian froze, her eyes darting from the document in Davis's hand to her husband's face. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice faltering. "We read the will. We saw the documents. There is no part two." "You saw the primary probate," Davis corrected, stepping deliberately into the center of the living room. "But your father was an incredibly observant man, Marcus. He built a financial empire from nothing, and he knew exactly who you were. He knew you were financially reckless, entirely obsessed with superficial status, and deeply inherently prejudiced against your own daughter's capabilities. He knew you would eventually try to strip away her independence to feed your own ego. Because of that, he established a secondary protocol. A sealed, highly confidential codicil held in private escrow to be triggered only under specific extreme circumstances." Davis paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out across the room. He looked directly at Marcus. Specifically, the protocol was to be triggered if you ever attempted to aggressively force Nia to surrender her inheritance, or if you actively participated in the malicious sabotage of her commercial enterprises. By conspiring with Bradley to bankrupt her firm and seize her assets tonight, you have officially triggered the codicil. I am here today to execute part two of the will." Marcus let out a sharp, nervous laugh, a barking sound devoid of any real humor. What else could he possibly give her? A few worthless stock options, a pat on the back. "It does not matter. We have our own wealth. We have this estate. We have our connections. She can have whatever scraps my father left hidden away." "Let us talk about this estate, Marcus," Davis said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "This magnificent $3 million Buckhead mansion, the ultimate towering symbol of your success and superiority." Vivian crossed her arms defensively, her chin lifting in a haughty display of denial. "It is paid for. We built this life." "It was foreclosed on," Davis stated flatly, dropping the absolute truth onto the glass coffee table like an anvil. The words hit the room with the force of a physical shockwave. Chloe, still kneeling on the floor next to a catatonic Bradley, gasped and looked up at her parents in horror. Marcus's face instantly lost all of its color, his skin turning a sickly ashen gray. His mouth opened, but no sound materialized. Exactly 5 years ago, you defaulted on your third mortgage. Davis continued pacing slowly around the perimeter of the seating area, his gaze locking onto Marcus. You were dangerously over-leveraged, drowning in massive debts from highly speculative, foolish investments and a lavish lifestyle you could not actually afford to maintain. The bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings. You were exactly 30 days away from being publicly evicted by the county sheriff. Your entire high society image was about to be obliterated. Vivian turned to Marcus, her hands shaking violently. Marcus, what is he talking about? She pleaded, her voice cracking. You told me you handled the bank. You said you refinanced through a private equity lender. He handled absolutely nothing. I interjected, stepping forward, my voice ringing with crushing, undeniable clarity. He was saved. He was bailed out like a reckless child, and he was far too arrogant to ever look into who his private savior actually was. Davis held up the thick legal document. A private investment firm named Apex Holdings swept in at the 11th hour. They bought your toxic debt directly from the bank, paid off the massive arrears in cash, and offered you an incredibly generous interest-only private mortgage to keep you in this house. You thought you had outsmarted the system. You thought you had found a brilliant Wall Street loophole. Davis stepped right up to Marcus, holding the document inches from his face. Apex Holdings is a private shell corporation created, funded, and entirely controlled by Jeremiah Hayes. Your father quietly bought the debt on your house to keep his family name from becoming a public embarrassment in Atlanta. He owned the paper Marcus. He owned the deed. He essentially let you live in this mansion on his own private charity. Marcus stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the mirrored backing of the wet bar. The crystal glasses rattled against the shelves. No, he whispered, shaking his head in absolute denial. No. My father would have told me. He would have held it over my head every single day. He would not have kept that a secret. He did not want your gratitude, Marcus, I said, looking directly into my father's terrified, hollow eyes. He wanted leverage. He saw the misogyny and the rot in your business practices. He wanted to make sure that if you ever tried to destroy the only person in this family with actual business acumen, I would have the ultimate, undeniable final word. Davis flipped the document open to the final page, reading the legally binding clause aloud for the entire room to hear. Upon the triggering of the secondary protocol, 100% of the shares, assets, and holding rights of Apex Holdings shall be transferred immediately, entirely, and irrevocably to my granddaughter, Nia Hayes. Davis snapped the heavy folder shut. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the silent mansion like a judge's gavel. The transfer was officially authorized and legally finalized by a federal judge this morning, Davis concluded, which means Mr. and Mrs. Hayes that Nia is now the sole undisputed owner of the holding company that possesses this property. She holds your debt. She holds the deed. Vivian collapsed backward onto the white leather sofa, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a horrified sob. She looked wildly around the opulent room, staring at the imported chandeliers, the sweeping marble staircase, the priceless modern art on the walls. The devastating realization washed over her in real time. Absolutely none of it belonged to her. The entire foundation of her elite socialite identity was a complete, pathetic fabrication. She was not a queen holding court in her castle. She was a tenant deeply in debt, and she was now entirely at the mercy of the daughter she had spent a lifetime degrading, tormenting, and trying to destroy. Marcus stared at me, his eyes wide and vacant. The booming patriarch, the man who constantly preached about male superiority, the man who demanded I bow to his authority, was completely fundamentally broken. He looked small, fragile, and entirely stripped of his power. You... Marcus whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible over the sound of Chloe weeping on the floor. You own the house. I own the house. I confirmed, my voice steady and resolute, projecting the exact authority he always claimed a woman could never possess. I own the walls. I own the roof. I own the marble floor you are standing on. You spent my entire life telling me I did not belong at the adults' table. You told me I lacked the pedigree, the intellect, and the killer instinct required to hold real power. You looked down on me because I am a black woman who refused to conform to your archaic, oppressive expectations, and you tried to use a corrupt, arrogant man to steal my grandfather's legacy. I took one final, deliberate step toward them, looking down at the two people who were supposed to protect me, but who chose instead to try and tear me apart for their own selfish gain. You told me to get out of your house, Vivian. I said my words precise and unforgiving as they sliced through the last remaining shreds of their pride. But you are severely mistaken. This is my house, and I am giving you exactly 30 days to pack your things and vacate my property. The immaculate aristocratic facade that Vivian Hayes had spent her entire adult life cultivating shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the imported marble floor. Her knees gave out, hitting the hard stone with a heavy thud that made the surrounding crystal drinkware vibrate. The woman who had spent decades looking down her nose at the world, who had just minutes ago demanded I be thrown out of her presence, was now kneeling at my feet. Her perfect, expensive makeup began to run as hot, frantic tears spilled over her cheeks. Her fingers clawed at the fabric of my suit jacket, her grip surprisingly strong, fueled by the sheer, unadulterated terror of losing everything that defined her existence. "Nia, please," Vivian sobbed, her voice cracking into a ragged, pathetic wail. Her chest heaved, pulling in desperate gasps of air. "I am your mother. You cannot do this. You cannot throw me out on the street. We are family. You cannot put your own mother out of her home." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had birthed me, but never actually loved me. I felt the frantic tugging of her hands against my jacket, but I felt absolutely no warmth, no sympathy, and no hesitation. The maternal bond she was suddenly so desperate to weaponize had been severed a long time ago by her own relentless cruelty. She was not crying because she loved me or because she regretted her horrific treatment of me. She was crying because the bank accounts were empty, the social status was gone, and the heavy mahogany doors of elite society were slamming shut in her face. I looked into her panicked, pleading eyes. They were wide and bloodshot, searching my face for any trace of the desperate approval-seeking daughter I used to be. She found nothing but ice. I reached down, my movements slow and deliberate, and peeled her trembling fingers off my jacket one by one. I let her hand drop back to her side. "Independence is what you always taught me, right?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet, perfectly mirroring the exact callous tone she had used against me 12 years ago when she had packed my bags and told me I was no longer her problem. Vivian flinched, as if I had struck her across the face. The memory of her own words clearly registered in her panicked mind, a ghost from the past, returning to deliver the final blow. "Now I am returning that lesson to you." I continued, stepping back to put a physical distance between us. "You have been living in a fantasy world, Vivian. And worst of all, you all have been staying in my house without paying a single cent of rent for the past half-year." Marcus, who had been leaning heavily against the wet bar like a defeated boxer on the ropes, suddenly pushed himself forward. His face was a mottled, unhealthy shade of purple. The sheer humiliation of his wife begging on the floor, combined with the reality of his own catastrophic financial ruin, triggered a final, desperate surge of his trademark patriarchal aggression. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat!" Marcus bellowed, though his voice lacked its usual booming resonance, cracking slightly at the edges. "You think you can just march in here with some legal paperwork and kick us to the curb? This is my property. I have lived here for 15 years. I have rights. We have residency rights. You cannot just evict us with a snap of your fingers. I will drag this out in court for years. I will tie you up in so much litigation you will beg to give this house back." Lawyer Davis stepped smoothly into the space between Marcus and me, his posture radiating the calm, lethal confidence of a man who destroys corporate titans before his morning coffee. He adjusted his glasses, looking at Marcus with an expression of profound professional pity. "Mr. Hayes, I strongly advise you to stop speaking before you completely destroy whatever tiny fraction of a future you might have left. Davis said, his tone crisp and entirely devoid of emotion. As the sole owner of Apex Holdings, my client does not just hold the deed to this property, she holds the entirety of your defaulted debt. Davis opened his briefcase again, retrieving a separate, neatly organized folder. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the data before looking back at my father. When Jeremiah Hayes purchased your toxic mortgages 5 years ago to save you from public bankruptcy, he structured the intervention as a private interest accumulating loan. Davis explained his words, dropping like heavy stones into the silent room. A loan that you have consistently failed to service. Apex Holdings has permitted you to remain on the premises as tenants at will. You have no lease. You have no equity. You have absolutely no legal standing to remain here. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but Davis raised a single authoritative finger, cutting him off completely. Furthermore, Davis continued, his voice growing sharper. My client was entirely accurate. The legal transfer of Apex Holdings was initiated 6 months ago, immediately following Jeremiah's passing. During that entire 6-month period, you have accrued back rent, property taxes, and maintenance liabilities payable directly to my client's holding company. If you attempt to fight this 30-day notice, or if you refuse to vacate the premises peacefully, we will not merely proceed with an expedited, highly publicized eviction. We will file an immediate civil suit to garnish any remaining assets you possess to recover the 6 months of unpaid debt. The reality of the trap finally closed around Marcus. He was not just losing his mansion, he was completely cornered by his own financial incompetence. If he fought, he would be publicly humiliated in the courts and drained of whatever pathetic scraps of capital he had hidden away. If he surrendered, he would be homeless within a month. The proud, arrogant businessman who had spent his life demanding subservience was utterly paralyzed. Over by the coffee table, Chloe was still kneeling beside a catatonic Bradley. She looked up, her face streaked with running mascara, her eyes wide with a new, horrifying realization. "Wait," Chloe stammered, her voice shaking as she looked from her parents to me. "If Mom and Dad are being evicted, and Bradley's assets are frozen by the federal government, where are we supposed to go? Where am I supposed to live?" I looked at my older sister, the golden child, the one who had always eagerly participated in my degradation, securely wrapped in the protective bubble of our parents' favoritism and her husband's Wall Street money. That bubble had just violently burst, leaving her exposed to the cold, harsh reality of the real world. "That sounds like a spectacular opportunity for you to practice some of that independence Vivian is always preaching about," I said coldly. Bradley remained completely silent on the floor. The federal agent Miller stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing on the marble. He looked down at the ruined director. "Mr. Scott," Agent Miller said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "You need to come with me right now. We have a vehicle waiting outside. You have a long night of federal questioning ahead of you." Bradley did not fight. He did not argue. All the arrogant bluster, the misogynistic superiority, the deep-seated belief that he was an untouchable master of the universe had been completely eradicated. He slowly pushed himself up off the floor, moving like a man twice his age. He did not look at Chloe. He did not look at my parents. And he certainly did not look at me. He simply kept his head down, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, as the federal agent escorted him toward the heavy double doors. Chloe let out another agonizing wail, burying her face in the expensive upholstery of the sofa she no longer owned. Vivian remained curled on the floor, weeping openly, mourning the death of her socialite empire. Marcus stood frozen, staring blankly at the wall, a hollow shell of a patriarch. I stood in the center of the devastation, breathing in the quiet, absolute finality of the moment. The war was over. The poison that had infected my life for decades had been surgically removed. I had not just survived their attempts to break me, I had dismantled their entire reality. I turned and walked toward the exit, my steps steady and unburdened, leaving them behind in the ruins of the life they had stolen, knowing they would never have the power to touch me again. I simply smiled. stepping into the back of my waiting car, and told my driver to take me home. The war was officially over and the victory was absolute. I reached into Arthur Davis's slim leather briefcase one final time, my fingers brushing against the crisp, heavy parchment we had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I pulled out the formal eviction notice. The bright red legal stamp at the top seemed to glow under the warm ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. With a swift, decisive motion, I tossed the document onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a sharp smack, coming to rest right on top of the fraudulent transfer papers Bradley had intended to use to steal my company. From the surface of the glass table looking upward, I knew exactly how I appeared to them. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was no longer the convenient punching bag or the perpetual disappointment they could bully into submission. I was the absolute architect of their ruin, towering over their shattered egos. My expression was carved from solid ice, reflecting the undeniable power I now held over the people who had spent a lifetime trying to make me feel worthless. "You have exactly 48 hours to clear out your belongings," I stated, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with unforgiving surgical clarity. "If you or anyone in this family is still on this property by Monday morning, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you for trespassing." I shifted my cold gaze to the pathetic figure still crumpled on the floor. "Bradley, prepare yourself for federal court. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not offer plea deals or sympathy to arrogant men who bypass corporate firewalls to steal $15 million of client capital." Finally, my eyes locked onto my older sister. Chloe was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as her perfectly styled hair clung to her tear-soaked face. She stared at the eviction notice as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "Chloe," I said, a cruel, deeply satisfied smile touching the corners of my mouth. "I sincerely hope you have not cut the tags off those new designer bags you bought this week. You are going to need to sell every single one of them just to pay for rent." Chloe let out a piercing, guttural shriek. She threw her manicured hands over her ears, violently shaking her head back and forth as the horrifying reality of her new impoverished existence crashed down upon her. Her pristine high society illusion was completely dead. I did not wait for another response. I did not need to. I turned on my heel, the sharp rhythmic click of my stilettos striking the imported marble floor, like the ticking of a clock marking the definitive end of their dynasty. I walked toward the grand double doors of the foyer, my head held high, my spine perfectly straight. Behind me, the curated, polite silence of the Hayes family mansion erupted into absolute anarchy. The aristocratic facade disintegrated instantly, replaced by the primal, vicious sounds of cornered animals tearing each other apart. Marcus found his voice a booming roar of misdirected rage, but he did not aim it at me. He aimed it at his wife. He screamed at Vivian, blaming her endless spending, her obsession with status, and her failure to secure Bradley's compliance for their complete destruction. Vivian screamed back, her voice shrill and hysterical, accusing Marcus of being a weak, incompetent fool who had allowed his own father to outsmart him from beyond the grave. She cursed his arrogance and his pathetic business acumen, her wails echoing harshly down the hallway. Over their vicious shouting, Chloe began to physically assault Bradley. I could hear her nails tearing at his bespoke suit, her fists pounding against his chest as she shrieked about her ruined life, her lost mansion, and the social humiliation she was about to endure among her elite friends. Bradley merely sobbed, a loud, pathetic wailing that mingled with the sharp crash of breaking glass as someone shoved an expensive crystal vase off a side table. They were tearing down their own kingdom from the inside out. I walked past the sweeping staircase, past the expensive oil paintings and the imported silk drapery entirely untouched by the venomous crossfire echoing behind me. Arthur Davis and Agent Miller fell into step beside me, their professional silence a sharp contrast to the domestic war zone we were leaving in our wake. Agent Miller gestured to his colleagues standing near the entrance, signaling them to move in and secure Bradley Scott for federal transport. I stepped through the heavy mahogany front doors and walked out into the cool, crisp Atlanta night. The driveway was illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles. The neighbors, the elite socialites my parents so desperately wanted to impress, were already peeking through their curtains, watching the magnificent downfall of the Hayes family unfold in real time. I paused at the door of my waiting town car. The night sky was clear, the stars bright above the sprawling estate that now belonged entirely to me. There was no guilt in my chest. There was no lingering sorrow for the family I was leaving behind. They had built their own cage of lies, greed, and arrogance, and I had simply locked the door. I slid into the plush leather seat of the car, pulling the heavy door shut. The thick seal blocked out the distant sounds of screaming and breaking glass still echoing from the mansion. The silence inside the cabin was profound and absolute. It was the sound of victory. It was the sound of freedom. The drive back to the city was a blur of glowing streetlights and shifting shadows. But for the first time in my entire existence, my chest felt completely clear. The suffocating weight of my family's expectations, their constant belittling, and their toxic manipulation had been entirely lifted. By the time the private elevator doors opened directly into my downtown penthouse, the adrenaline of the evening had settled into a deep, unwavering, profound peace. I walked across the dark hardwood floors, sliding the heavy glass door open, and stepped out onto the sprawling balcony. The cool night air washed over me. Below, the city skyline sparkled like a sea of diamonds, a sprawling grid of light and life that felt entirely mine. 6 months have passed since that night in Buckhead, and the fallout was nothing short of absolute devastation for the Hayes family. The empire they thought they controlled disintegrated with terrifying speed. Marcus and Vivian did not just lose the mansion. They lost the one thing they valued above all else, their reputation. The foreclosure and the subsequent eviction became highly publicized public record. In the ruthless world of high society, financial ruin is the ultimate unforgivable sin. They were swiftly and unceremoniously stripped of their elite country club memberships, quietly removed from charity gala invitation lists, and entirely shunned by the wealthy circles they had spent their lives worshiping. Today, the former king and queen of Atlanta real estate are renting a cramped, outdated two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Marcus spends his days drafting pathetic business proposals that no bank will ever fund, while Vivian sits in a tiny living room, drowning in the bitter reality of her own mediocrity. Bradley's downfall was even more spectacular. The federal investigation dismantled his entire life in a matter of weeks. Faced with irrefutable digital evidence of wire fraud, embezzlement, and overriding corporate compliance protocols, he did not even have the leverage to negotiate a favorable plea deal. The arrogant Wall Street titan who believed he could casually steal $15 million to stroke his own fragile ego is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. His assets were entirely liquidated by the government to repay the stolen capital. But perhaps the most profound poetic justice belongs to my older sister. When the federal authorities froze Bradley's accounts, Chloe was left with absolutely nothing. The luxury cars were repossessed, the Hamptons' property was seized. Driven to sheer desperation to afford basic rent and legal fees, she was forced to sell off every single piece of her beloved designer wardrobe. Today, the golden child who once ridiculed me for working too hard is employed as a retail sales associate at a mid-tier department store in a suburban mall. She spends 40 hours a week wearing a cheap polyester uniform, forcing a fake customer service smile, and ringing up the very same society women she used to mock behind their backs. As for me, my commercial real estate firm has never been stronger. Without the constant threat of Marcus's sabotage or Bradley's illegal surveillance, my acquisitions have tripled in value. I took the toxic, contaminated properties that Bradley blindly purchased to ruin me, and watched from a safe distance as the Environmental Protection Agency buried his former firm in millions of dollars of federal cleanup fines. I handled my business just as the true heirs of Jeremiah Hayes always should have done. I leaned against the glass railing of the balcony, looking out over the glittering skyline, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. My grandfather did not just leave me money or a secret holding company. He left me the ultimate weapon. He left me the right to purge the toxic people hiding behind the word family. Society conditions us to accept abuse from the people who share our blood. We are taught to forgive the unforgivable simply because of a shared last name. But if anyone ever tells you that blood is thicker than water, remember this one undeniable truth. Respect must be mutual. If they view your independence as a threat, if they scheme to steal your peace, and if they treat you like trash, do not bow down to them. Use your success as a bulldozer to crush their arrogance.